again with another episode of the award-winning Everything Compliance. Today we have the quartet of Jay Rosen, Jonathan Marks, Matt Kelly, and Professor Karen Woody. Welcome back, Karen.
Thanks, guys. I've missed you.
So we have missed you. We're going to start with Matt. What's on your mind this week, Matt?
Well, Tom, I wanted to turn to FCPA compliance today because I have noticed over the past 6 months or so that we are seeing a bunch of settlements, and we can go through who some of these companies are, but settlements that seem rather troublesome and egregious, and yet somehow these companies manage to avoid a compliance monitor. But what's happening here seems to be this evolving set of expectations from the Justice Department that we have gone from getting an independent compliance monitor to companies instead agreeing to enhanced compliance reporting. And in fact, of course, the companies are going because that is less onerous than a compliance monitor. I suppose the real news here is that the Justice Department is now agreeing to this. So here's an example of what I mean. Over the last 6 months, I can think of at least 4 FCPA enforcement actions we've seen: SAP, Gunvor, Trafigura, and Freepoint. They have all settled FCPA violations that were fairly significant, at least, if not really significant, where they all had some mix of either recidivist behavior or failure to self-disclose the misconduct or failure to cooperate in the investigation, at least at the start, although the companies did seem to drink the Kool-Aid later on, and they were cooperating fully by the end. But these are problematic things. And according to the corporate enforcement policy from the Justice Department, according to the guidelines of the monitorships that they have published, if you fail on those fronts, you are much more likely to get a monitor. And yet, here we have these, at least the 4, and I might be forgetting some, that they don't have a monitor. But instead, the Justice Department has been requiring these enhanced compliance reporting obligations where the company has to come up with a detailed work plan for what it will be doing during the term of its deferred prosecution or its plea agreement. I think Gunvor was one that actually pleaded guilty, so they had a plea agreement, not a DPA. But they have these 3-year terms after their settlements. That's not unusual. And then they have to, for each of these 3-year terms, each year, come up with a work plan for improvements to their program. They have to then, at the end of that first year, submit essentially a progress report. And they have to do it again for the second and the third year. They have to meet in interim periods, at least annually, if not quarterly or more often, in person with fraud section people to just discuss how's it going. And here's our latest data. Here's our progress. And they're doing this in person. I guess they're doing it over the phone. They're doing it in writing. But they're doing it with the Justice Department, not a monitor. And even, Tom, what's striking is that these settlements are expressly say that in lieu of a monitor, we have decided that given the enhanced reporting obligations and the company's late cooperation and its efforts and whatnot, and blah, 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 we decided a compliance monitor is not necessary. So the fraud section at Justice is actually saying this is a satisfactory substitute for a compliance monitor. In theory, from time to time, but so far it has been every time for at least the last 4 or 5 FCPA enforcement actions we've seen. And then this finally reached, I guess, what I would call a logical conclusion is that there's so much reporting and so much data tracking that is kind of sort of like a compliance monitorship anyways, that SAP advertised for a compliance monitor liaison. They had created a monitorship liaison office, and they had upgraded one of their internal compliance employees to be a compliance monitorship officer. And they don't have a monitor, but they're treating it like a monitorship anyways, because there's going to be so much data and reporting that has to happen. I don't quite know what to make of this. I don't quite know how I feel about it. But I do think that it is noteworthy that these monitorship standards are at least receding in substitute for these enhanced reporting requirements. But it leaves me wondering with a couple of different questions, such as how would a company staff up this reporting obligation? Are you going to go SAP's route, which is a little bit, I don't guess, comical or Kafkaesque or something, where they basically give the person the title of a monitorship officer or liaison without an actual monitorship there? Most companies, I suspect, were probably doing something similar anyways. They just didn't call it a monitorship liaison like SAP did. But do you have the wherewithal to be able to do all of that? Don't forget that at the end of all of this reporting and work plans and everything else, the compliance officer still has to certify to the effectiveness of the compliance program. So I wonder if this more close ongoing oversight from Justice, is this going to lead to more pressure when you actually have to certify your program? And what if it turns out that the certification is wrong and they find that there was a violation or another failure of some kind during that DPA? How badly will that reflect on the CCO who certified? But then I also have another question. What happens if the Trump administration comes back in power? Lord help us. But Trump or any other Republican, how would they treat this? Would they continue to have, interim enhanced reporting, but never actually read the reports? Would they not take it seriously? It seems like this might be a valid idea for people who take corporate enforcement seriously, but if you have a Republican administration like Trump that probably will not, then where do we go with this? I don't know. I speculate that this could have some unforeseen consequences. Anyways, Tom, that's what has been on my mind with FCPA enforcement lately.
So we happen to have a subject matter expert on at least monitorships, and certainly independent integrity monitors on our panel. Jay Rosen, questions, thoughts, or other?
Questions. I'm sure this doesn't solve the problem, but a couple of years ago, Lisa Monaco expressly got out into the marketplace and said, look, the death of the FCPA monitor is not now. That is still something that we're going to prescribe and we're going to do. But my question, Matt, is do we take a look at what the DOJ says, that Monaco says the monitors haven't gone away? Or do we look at what the troubling tea leaves are that you just quoted over the last 5 minutes? Why aren't they going with a monitorship? So I don't know if you can square what Dag Monaco said with what you're feeling, Matt, but that's my question.
Well, I don't know where the monitors went, because I can tell you where they're not. They are not here in these last 4 cases that we've seen, when you could reasonably argue that any of the 4 would deserve a monitor. You could also maybe reasonably argue that they don't. But one thing that has occurred to me, and several people have told me this, people with Justice Department insights and experience, once upon a time, back in the Obama administration, there really was only one person who actually read these progress reports or compliance updates that happened back then. There was only one person who read them very closely and understood them, and that was the compliance counsel at DOJ, a woman named Wei Chen, who is very thoughtful about compliance issues. But she left at the start of the Trump administration. The Trump administration never bothered to fill the compliance counsel role. No surprise there. But then when the Biden administration came back, that is when the DOJ did start to say they might not necessarily fill that compliance counsel role again. And I don't believe that they have. Instead, what they've been doing is hiring more fraud section employees who have compliance experience and are also prosecutors, or are in leadership roles at the fraud section. So Matt Galvin, who is a former compliance professional at AB InBev and who is now one of the senior people at Fraud, I bet he reads these reports, and I bet he knows how to read them. Glenn Leon, who's the head of the fraud section, I believe he still is, unless he left and I missed that, but he had been at Fraud for a while and he ran it, and he was also a compliance officer. So he'd know how to read these reports. He'd know how to have these meetings. So would Matt Galvin. And I think there are other lower level people at Fraud who are more versed in what a good compliance program should be doing and how that should be bending the curve for a corporate culture. So maybe they can get away with not needing a compliance counsel in-house, and that's, I think, is their rationale for, do we really need to therefore also have an independent compliance monitor? I don't know, because when I asked the DOJ to talk to me about this, they declined to comment. For the record, SAP also declined to comment on why they created a monitorship office without a monitor, but I don't think it's a far-fetched or unreasonable idea for them. Actually, I think it's a good idea. The title's a bit weird, but the substance of it is quite smart. But, like, under what circumstance then are we actually going to see a monitor again? And if some of them are recidivists, like SAP was, if some of them failed to voluntarily self-disclose, like I believe Gunvor, Trafigura, and SAP all did, if some of them are not cooperating fully at the start, which Trafigura didn't, and I don't think Freeport or Gunvor did either. I mean, they came around, but it wasn't at the start. Like, what are we doing here? What are the criteria that would make the current Justice Department then say, yes, now let's get an independent compliance monitor? I don't have a good answer to that, because the actions, like, they clearly they show some other line of thinking.
All right. Professor Woody, we had the opportunity, I think at the last session you were on, to visit on a court case which was upcoming, which involved insider shadow trading called Panuwa. Since that time, that case has gone to trial and we've had a conviction. It seemed to be the consensus of the panel back then that no matter what you might or might not think about the doctrine, the facts of this case would point to someone who used insider information. Now that everything from the trial has come out, I wanted to start with asking, has your opinion, our initial opinion, or your initial opinion changed? But more importantly, what takeaways should our in-house counsel brethren use for training or changing policies and procedures based on this conviction?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating last couple of weeks here, thanks to this case that, depending on who you ask, was a completely novel, nearly case of first impression, but we don't need to go that far. Interestingly, there was a motion limine in the trial about where the SEC argued that the defense was not allowed to say that this was novel or first of its kind or some sort of new thing. Because the SEC's stance on this whole thing is this is a straight down the line misappropriation case. So for those of you guys who don't recall, this was a case where Matthew Panuwa works for Medivation. Medivation gets a bid from Pfizer to be taken over. Obviously, Matthew knows that because he works for Medivation, but he ends up trading in a different company called Insight based on that information. And they're realizing that how Medivation's progress or how their share value would increase or decrease based on that information. That also might be the same case for Insight. So it's a peer type firm. Hence, that's why it's called shadow trading. Sorry, the dog here. So Matthew was convicted of insider trading. And so interestingly, I think there are a few takeaways here. First, of course, this is going to be appealed. This seems to be something, obviously, that this person took all the way to trial. There's no settling before this. And I think we'll see an appeal based on this jury conviction. And I think we'll have it on a few angles. I think we'll see an appeal. I don't know if they can appeal this idea that, like, they were not allowed to say that this was an unusual, new, unanticipated, type of case. I think that might have fallen away to some extent, but there's, I think, some real traction on there being an appeal based on the jury instructions in this case, because I think there is a little bit here to suggest that Panuwa might have some legs on his argument about what the jury instructions said. And we see this all the time. The wording of jury instructions can make or break certain things. So Panuwa wanted the jury instructions to state that he knowingly breached a fiduciary duty owed to Medivation. That is pretty straight down the line what the requirement is in insider trading. But the SEC wanted it diluted a little bit to just be that Medivation entrusted Panawat with confidential information, and that he basically hadn't gotten their consent to trade on that information, even in Insight stock. So, like I said, fiduciary duty of trust and confidence. We're quibbling over sort of the same thing, but those are the kind of things that can really make a big difference. And as we know, insider trading at this point is entirely common law driven. Nothing in the statute says any of these things. So every one of these is sort of just building on previous case law, which is why each sort of nuance in facts or nuance in jury instructions start to have major consequences. Panawat also was challenging how, the materiality, basically, that it was this idea that this information about Medivation actually mattered to Insight. He really did take on this idea that Insight and Medivation aren't as sort of one-to-one peer-linked firms as the SEC had suggested, that they weren't necessarily competitors, that there isn't necessarily a link that one of these companies' successes translates to the other's success. So he was trying to sort of separate and really exacerbate the distance between these two companies. And that in itself is maybe you need some economic experts, or however, I think that really is the nugget of this case that everyone had a problem with, which is how much are these things literally, are they, I mean, not literally, but how linked are they such that this inside information about Medivation can equally apply to other firms. So in that case, like I said, it's not over. I imagine we'll see an appeal up to the Ninth Circuit on this. Where this goes going forward is, as I said, I think in the last panel, that maybe 10b5-1 plans, or at least restricted tradings for employees, needs to be tightened up a little bit, just because employees could be exposed to insider trading liability if they, are rightfully following even maybe a narrow insider trading policy that says I won't trade on this information in the shares of this company, but that needs to be brought into and also these 10, 15, name it, sort of other companies that would be seen as economically linked, such that this would be shadow trading. And so the paper I had, posited this idea of 10b5-1 plans maybe need to include all of your peer companies. That sort of same idea of this is now going to be what you're prescribed from doing if you have any information here. So we'll see. I mean, I think it's like I said in the last time, I think the reason I didn't think this was going to be going in Panawat's favor is because of that employment agreement he had signed. So there's proof that he did breach, that he did something wrong. He's trading in this. The question is his trading in Insight the equivalent of breaching that employment agreement? And in this case, it was, because it was a really broad insider trading policy. It said I wouldn't trade in any other company. So I think on that alone, these particular facts make this case maybe a little more open shut. But if you had a different insider trading policy or not an insider trading policy at the company, maybe this goes a little bit of a different way. So who knows? I think, keep watching this space.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Karen?
I suppose a comment, although if it leads you to a question, I'd love to hear your answer, Karen. But I keep coming back to, aside from the legal complexities here, which you do an excellent job of laying them out, there is still a real ethical risk in allowing this sort of thing to happen. I mean, in my non-lawyer perspective, I look at it as that Mr. Panawat had material, non-public information that he traded, that he exploited for financial gain. And that's it. I mean, I, as a random investor, I did not have access to that information. And there wasn't really any way that you could kind of figure this out or derive the right conclusion that you too, mere investor on the street, could also have the same lucrative investing opportunities that he did. And my fear would be that if for some reason this was allowed to stand, it really just smacks of that guy had some inside info and then he used it for financial gain that the other people in the company, the mere mortals, the regular employees, we don't have access to that. It sets up this undeserved privilege. And as soon as you create that dynamic, your whole corporate culture and control environment is at risk, because most people would look at that and say, he gets to do that thing, and I'm on the outside and he's on the inside. If he can do that, that means morally, I guess I'm okay to be able to do these other things that only I can do. And some people might say that's cheating, but that's them on their outside while I'm here on my inside. And it is an unfortunate slippery slope. And so I thought he would wind up convicted. I hope this conviction stands. I can appreciate there's a lot of legal and policy nuance here that needs to be refined. But if you clear all that away, there's a real cut and dried ethical issue here that just doesn't pass the smell test. And that is what I think a lot of senior executives just keep in mind. Because if you let one thing stay, a whole lot of other stuff.
Mr. Marks, you have a question or comment?
I had a question for Professor Woody, and that is, would it have been a little bit different, maybe, possibly, if he wasn't the head of business development? And then I have a comment, which may turn into a question or some commentary. And that is, I think this is a great reminder from a lessons learned perspective, that when you're doing training and you're onboarding someone and you give them your insider trading policy and they sign off on it, or they sign off on an employment agreement, it can't be a set it and forget it exercise. These things need to be monitored. Those things need to be brought up on a regular and ongoing basis. And then lastly, when it comes to business development, any type of business development where you're dealing with this sensitive information, there needs to be controls around that. There just does. And there needs to be someone who is really, overseeing this, maybe at the board level or the audit committee or somebody from there, because, I've been involved in many, many, many mergers, acquisitions or whatnot, where there's been this, okay, we can't say anything because of all of these things that we're talking about now. And I can guarantee you this, I'm sitting in a cafeteria at one of the companies, I'm not going to name one, and all of a sudden I hear two people talking about, like, how the heck do they know? There's no way that they could know what's going on. But nobody today can keep a secret. And so, it's like kind of one of those things, but it has to be monitored and it has to be controlled.
Yeah. I mean, I do think the fact that he was sort of in the catbird seat there as business development is a fact that didn't help him at all. I mean, I don't know how much that would be legally significant, because, as you say, you could kind of learn this in some other way, just any sort of insider motivation. He had certainly access to that. His, one of his defenses was an attempt to say, this wasn't, everyone knew that there had been some suitors for Medivation and also even for Insight. He pushed back on this being effectively non-public. I guess materiality and non-public sort of run together in this defense of his, which is, this is something anyone could have probably surmised or sussed out in some way. And so I don't know, he sort of was trying to take on every element that he could of whether this was material, non-public information. But I take your point, I think this is going to have to result in some tighter controls, much clearer controls about what is allowed and not allowed. I mean, I think his argument is, how different is this than, I do think the fact that to the point of he was the business development person at Medivation, but, imagine you're just driving by, you see a bunch of, Pfizer trucks outside Medivation, and then you keep driving and you think, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what's happening there. Can you piece these things together? I mean, that's actually the whole problem with some of insider trading, that some inside trading is completely legitimate, even though it feels wrong. Like, to Matt's point, I think the problem with insider trading is that it all intuitively feels like an opposite of what we want. We want it to be always an even playing field. And I think the trickiness with it is that it never will be. There always will be someone who has a little bit, just knows something else that maybe someone else doesn't. But I take it. I think this was one that will be tricky to overturn on appeal, certainly.
Well, it goes back to the old cookie example that I always give when I teach my ethics class, and that is, I don't know if you remember when you used to check into a hotel room and it'd be 11 o'clock at night and you'd be traveling 14 hours a day because your flights were canceled, and the only thing left there was a bag of, a thing of Pringles and a thing of cookies, and if you took it off, you got billed for it, right? But then you went down into the gift shop later, and that same $9 bag of cookies was $2. So you bought the $2 bag and you put it back on the plate in your room, and you're like, oh, I never ate the cookies.
I've never done this, Jonathan.
well, guess what? It happens all the time. And, it's like, ethics, really, what is it? It's really, it goes back to character and morals, right? And it's what you really do or don't do when nobody's watching. And that's, I think, fundamentally, Matt, you brought up a point, from an ethical perspective, he should have known to stay the frick away from this, and he didn't.
Karen, let me go in a little bit different direction because I had thought you had to pair material non-public information with a fiduciary duty not to use that information. So, and if someone was able to suss out, someone was able to suss out information, it obviously was not non-public because they were able to figure it out, whether they drove past and saw a bunch of Pfizer trucks or whether they were the best AI/Google/internet researcher ever, kind of point one. Point two, though, is do I now have a fiduciary duty with all competitors of the Compliance Podcast Network? That I can no longer trade in their stocks because I am an industry expert? And can you assume a fiduciary duty to a third party who is not a signatory to a contract where you've made that agreement? Can a third party be a beneficiary of being claimed that I now have a fiduciary duty to a third party? I guess that's the point I'm kind of stuck on.
Yeah, so the answer is yes, it can be a beneficiary, but the duty doesn't run to that third party. So the breach of duty was him to Medivation, and he wants that to be sort of a much sort of more robust fiduciary duty of care, that kind of idea. Whereas the SEC wants it a little watered down. Just this was entrusted into you. This was this presumption of confidentiality in this exchange, which you do see written into 10b-5-2, which we got, which is after, this is the kind of stuff over the Mark Cuban case of just this. If we have an agreement that this is going to be held in confidence, then breaching that agreement is enough for misappropriation theory. And that goes to the source of the information, not to who you ultimately trade in. And that was the expansion from misappropriation theory that was different than classical insider trading, which is just, I know this because I'm in this company. I now can't trade in this particular company only. That's how those who wanted to cabin insider trading to a much more narrow frame wanted it just at that. So when you start trading in other things that you have no relationship to, certainly no fiduciary duty to, everyone wanted that to be tossed, that were like the sort of more conservative court of keeping this aside. But since the O'Hagan case that Ginsburg wrote, we now have blessed misappropriation theory, which is even if there is a beneficiary, if that's insider or whomever, the other thing you're trading in, the duty doesn't run there. The duty runs to how you learn the information. So if you've gotten information through some type of breach of duty, or I guess I should say also, if it was supposed to be a duty of confidence to that source of information, and then you break it and go trade on it, then that's enough. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Are you talking about access to the data, the material non-public data? Is that what you're saying?
Yes. So he was supposed to keep that in confidence and not use it. So trading on it is the breach, and the breach actually is between him and his employer. It's almost this idea that the information belongs to Medivation. It's almost this idea of it's almost like a trade secret kind of thing. You've now breached a duty to Medivation in this promise to not use that information for your own gain. So insight is just a
what if he
third.
lost $2 million? Were we talking about this?
If he lost money on it?
Yeah.
There's actually a really recent article that was interesting about this, because I think the answer is well, that's crazy. That's not very good inside information if you didn't make any money on it. But this woman actually at Michigan, the business school in Michigan, wrote about how there can be advantage to that. Like if you want to if you have some tax benefit, there's some reason you want to take an L, take the loss on something, that could maybe still be problematic. It technically is by the letter of the law. You're trading on inside information, but the fact that it went the other way, I don't know. It's an interesting article, but that's sort of a new theory.
All right, Jonathan Marks, you work with a lot of chief audit executives. And what I wanted to pose to you was, what are some of the top questions that they're either on their mind, some of the top issues they are coming to you for guidance, or what do you see as really what's driving their concerns right now?
I think there's a couple of studies that have come out, but I think one of the key things, even that's in the top 4 or 5 always is, and especially today, is talent shortage. The level of talent that's out there. Because of the mandate that there's been placed on getting your CPA, which is a 5-year, 150-hour type of thing, and a lot of folks can't afford that. They need to get into the workforce. But a lot of people don't want that lifestyle anymore either. So it's a pretty demanding lifestyle to be, in internal audit. And so I think talent shortage is a huge, huge, huge issue that we're all dealing with. The other thing, there's a couple of other things too that go along with that from a risk perspective. And obviously, if you don't have talent, you're not going to be able to fulfill your audit plan. If you're not able to fulfill your audit plan, you might have risks that are dangling out there that are, waving a red flag at you that you might never find. So that's how that all comes to play. Third party risks, which we all talk about all the time, is certainly something that keeps us up all at night. Now it's third party risk, fourth party risks, and things like that. So, as the supply chains become more and more complex, and as the world becomes more and more bottlenecked as a result of certain events, and sanctions are imposed and things like that, it's become an interesting playing field now. So third party risks certainly become a huge issue for chief audit executives today. Cyber threats, I think that'll stay for a while as being sort of one of those things that are a key risk for a chief audit executive. So I know the studies say that. I see it as well. There's a lot of conversations around that. But security and privacy, kind of is also tucked in there as well, with regards to data and things like that. So I think that's another one. And then the other one is, technology that, people talk about technology and technology disruptions. Organizations are becoming more and more data driven and relying on these vendors, which expands the aspect of cyber risk. So there's some interplay there between technology, data privacy, cyber threats, and the like. And so it's a real interesting time right now. But I think, for me, the thing that I keep hearing from everyone is they can't find talent. They continually struggle to find talent. And when they do find talent, a lot of times folks are not staying for the length of period that they would like them to stay. They'll either move into the organization, or they'll move into something else, or they're not going to stay at all. They'll just keep jumping from organization to organization just because, the demands are just absolutely just too great. And, it's a real issue. It's an absolute real issue. It's literally like I was talking to an audit committee member not too long ago, and I said it's like having a firehouse with 2 trucks, and only one person that's qualified to drive one of the trucks can't drive, and there is no person to drive the other truck, and no person to work the to hold and work some of the hoses. If there was a massive fire and you can only roll out one truck and you needed 2, it's a problem. It's the same thing in an organization with regards to the risk landscape. Like I said, if you can't execute on your plan, your audit plan, assuming you do all the other things properly, you leave the organization exposed. So it's going to be interesting to see what really happens with the internal auditors. And, now that compliance has really come into play here. And, we've talked about this ad nauseum with regards to, how compliance is really where internal audit was maybe 15 or 16 or 17 years ago. And, so it'll be interesting to see how this whole thing sort of manifests itself, and also what the professional organizations wind up doing about this as well as some of the licensing folks with regards to some of these credentials. So that's kind of what's out there. But it also, if you read some of these reports just to finalize things, it really emphasizes that you can't just do periodic risk management anymore. That's really insufficient in today's environment. And that's why you do need these staff, because it's really about sort of this continuous auditing and continuous monitoring type of mentality that you really do need to stay ahead, with regards to today's current risk landscape, both within the enterprise and within now the extended enterprise as well.
Jonathan, my perception is that audit has traditionally done a retrospective review, meaning they've looked back at something that has happened. It could be a very deep dive into a narrow topic, but it's typically looking back. Do you see chief audit executives moving forward to what you just ended with, which is sort of a continuous audit or a continuous risk audit as a part of a continuous risk management program?
My old firm, we had this saying, now for tomorrow. And I truly believe that that really needs to be the mentality. There's a reason why the windshield is probably 25 times larger than the rearview mirror. And so I think knowing what we know today, and it's not good enough to be a historian anymore. It really is. Do we have? These are the questions and this goes back to the board a little bit too, and the audit committee. Is the audit committee really challenging the chief audit executive to be proactive and look out the windshield? Here we are today. Do we have the right things in place, for tomorrow, the next day, in the near future? And do we understand what our barriers, obstacles, and hurdles are in order to achieve our the objectives that we've outlined in our strategy? Because remember, the board, one of the board's key roles is to advise on strategy. The other one is to monitor, right? So if we're not able to execute on all these things because we don't have certain things in place, I think that really changes the mindset of the audit process. Again, Tom, from what you're talking about, being an historian, to really looking now for tomorrow and the next day and in the future. So I do think that there's some of that coming into the play. A lot of the folks that I've grown up with in this space are talking about that now and have that mentality. So I think they are doing the right thing. The problem is, again, a lot of times is being able to execute on all this and making sure that there is a program that is fundamentally that will run itself in order to achieve those particular objectives. And I hate to go back to the talent thing again, but a lot of these things, without those mechanisms and those elements in there, they're just not going to be effective.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Jonathan?
Well, just kind of gaming out what a lot of what Jonathan is saying, what that would ideally look like in practice at a large company. If we want to get more to a forward-looking, continuous monitoring or continuous auditing of risk management, whatever we want to call it, but really it is much more about the audit team who knows what the internal controls could do, talking with the business to figure out here are the risks, and then we are going to build this essentially an algorithm to monitor for that risk. The audit team could build the algorithm to test it and measure the risk once at a point in time, but then give that off to the business unit and say, now go forth and monitor thyself 24 hours a day. We'll be back next quarter, or we'll be back next year. And if there's anything strange that happens, it'll show up on the algorithm, then we'll come knocking instead. But it gets to that. It's much more of a consultative, IT-driven sort of a function. And I know there's going to be some audit purists who wonder about objectivity, and I get that. I'm not sure how truthful that is, or are we being hypersensitive to that? But the need is for that sort of algorithmic oversight approach embedded right into the operations that I just said. But that's also points to what you said about a talent shortage. Show me the people who actually know how to do this, because audit teams, I think, know that what I just said is right, but how would you actually build all of that? That's tech. How would you get the sense of what the right risk is? You're talking to the business unit. That's interpersonal skills. There's a lot of audit teams that are lacking in that. So I think it's going to be a bumpy journey to get there, even if we all kind of sort of have a sense of what that should look like.
No, I think your comments are spot on, Matt. And you and I have had either direct or indirect conversations about controls, and actually this is not automating a control. It's actually putting technology in a control type of, in an environment, and working with the business and making sure that there is that communication. If you take it one step further and go up a level, it's really, at the end of the day, fundamentally building an enterprise risk resilient ecosystem where you have management, where you have compliance, where you have audit, and where you have legal, all communicating and collaborating with one another on a regular and ongoing basis. So there's good information flow and information sharing, and using that feedback in order to, make sure that there are no issues. And if there are, then on a timely basis going in and fleshing those things out. And that's the continuous part of all of this. And without that, without the right talent, again, it comes back to, best laid plans. But if you can't execute on that, sounds great on paper, but it's not going to help the organization.
Jay Rosen, I cannot think of an area of compliance that is currently as dynamic as export controls. I know you've taken a look at that, and literally this week we've had additional sanctions levied against individuals and countries. Where does a compliance officer or an export control specialist begin to start at this point in time?
Yeah, great question, Tom. On March 27th through the 29th of this year, the U.S. Department of Commerce's Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, hosted an update conference on export control policies. And it was appropriate for the event coincided with the opening day of the U.S. baseball season. And BIS officials emphasized that they and those who they regulate are playing a whole new national security ballgame. More than 20 U.S. companies have recently received red flag letters listing more than 600 foreign parties and third countries that have continued to sell dual-use items to Russia, arguably putting those companies on notice of the high probability of evasion or diversion. In 2023, BIS initiated an effort to identify customers of U.S. companies and distributors within supply chains that were continuing to ship high-priority items to Russia. BIS then sent the U.S. companies a red flag letter identifying specific customers of theirs who had been identified in customs data continuing to export illegally to Russia. BIS encouraged the companies receiving those letters to both use heightened due diligence for the identified customers and to further augment their export screening efforts by purchasing commercially available data sets on Russian imports and screening against them. Additional steps were very recently taken. In the last several weeks, BIS has sent letters to more than 20 companies, each containing a list of more than 600 foreign parties identified in the data sets. Unfortunately, these parties have continued to sell dual-use items to Russia. When you have knowledge that items you ship through third countries are in fact designed for Russia, a license is required. And in light of these circumstances, BIS continued information to help companies avoid becoming involved in illegal diversions such as to Russia. Yet, according to an official with the Office of Enforcement Analysis, some companies' initial response reflected legacy export controls thinking by asking whether a license was now required to export to the identified third country parties. The official, with some incredulity, observed that companies should be considering the broader impact of having been told by the government that such third parties were transshipping components to Russia. The broader impact relates to companies' knowledge. Are companies now aware of actual evasion or diversion of shipments involving listed third-party counterparties, or rather third country parties? Alternatively, are they regardless now aware, absent risk-based diligence showing the contrary, that the equally problematic high probability of evasion of diversion, which allows the government to prosecute without proving actual knowledge? And how should they evaluate the risk when they are presented with substitute parties for the same trade flows? The Assistant Secretary noted publicly that high risk of transshipment to Russia posed by such third parties. Companies choosing to continue translations involving these parties directly or indirectly should now anticipate that BIS and the U.S. Department of Justice National Security Division would likely consider to be aware of high probability evasions or diversions unless they can demonstrate the contrary through credible risk. Here's some battlefield recoveries, and trade data remains at the top of focus. U.S. officials remain deeply concerned about Russia and their ability to obtain items for military use, and are focused on evidence recovered from the battlefield. U.S. officials highlighted the significance of recent hypersonic missile attacks by Russia against civilian targets in Ukraine. They noticed that several hypersonic missiles have been recovered and that they contain significant amounts of U.S. designed or manufactured components. And just as the Iranian manufactured unmanned aerial watch vehicles, UAVs, and Koreans manufactured ballistic missiles, they have already been the subject of media and NGO reports. Regarding trade data, the BIS Office of Technology Evaluation shared with attendees a chart showing a significant spike in Russia in the import of certain common high priority list goods from China and Hong Kong in December of 2023. The December 2023 spike is exceeded only by a spike in December 2021, a few months before Russia's further invasion into Ukraine on February 24th of 2022. Companies should accordingly remain vigilant regarding exports to China and Hong Kong. BIS emphasized that front-end investments and compliance efforts are better than back-end fines through enforcement actions, and that companies should expect current enforcement trends to continue. As Secretary Axelrod highlighted, the front-end compliance and back-end enforcement are linked. He cautioned that companies that choose not to invest in compliance will significantly increase their risks that an item will be unlawfully exported, and that we will aggressively enforce mitigating national security costs, money, one way or the other. Although some have previously reacted to BIS, warnings of increased enforcement with caution and skepticism. Assistant Secretary Axelrod warned, these to be tempted to dismiss this as just tough talk. Last year saw the highest number of convictions, temporary denial orders, and post-conviction denials. BIS officials pointed to last year's record standalone administrative penalty of $300 million against Seagate Technologies, and previewed that multiple penalties of this magnitude are forthcoming, doubling down on the big game hunting that January 2024 policy changes suggested. Compliance officials should point to these statements and to the actual increased enforcement in 2023 to more than justify front-end investments in compliance. BIS officials repeatedly emphasize that the traditional due diligence is not sufficient. Risk-based due diligence is required beyond traditional screening tools. BIS officials emphasize that traditional due diligence and know your customer screening, while still necessary, is no longer sufficient to address these risks that are posed by Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. An Undersecretary of Commerce for the Industry and Security, Alan F. Estevez, noted, traditional due diligence is no longer sufficient, especially if your company or your clients have complicated distribution networks. He further cautioned that enhanced compliance was necessary across the industry, not just at the 20 U.S. companies who received letters. Here's some practical steps for companies' in-house legal and compliance teams and their boards. First off, appreciate that BIS reviews itself today as a U.S. agency with a national security mission, not just commercial facilitation, and you should recalibrate your risk assessment accordingly. Undersecretary Estevez emphatically noted that he wants to be clear, export controls are a national security tool, not an economic protectionist tool. And given the global threat environment we currently face, our enforcement efforts have never been more central to America's national security strategy. In this context, responding to the red flag letters by asking how best to continue business with the listed third parties is a failure of understanding and how to appreciate the new ballgame. Before responding to questions from the media, the U.S. Congress investigators investors, activist shareholders should consider how the data and the messaging will be either perceived or potentially misperceived. Taking a combative or dismissive approach that in other times might be accepted commercial practice is out of touch with a national security effort to reduce adversaries' ability to manufacture and use weapons to kill friendly nations. Consider whether there are creative, sincere ways to engage with the media, Congress, and shareholders that protect the company's interests. And as DAG Lisa Monaco has said for the last 2 years, sanctions are the new FCPA. But there's still time to reduce reinforcement net risk by making front-end investments in compliance, but the window for doing so may be closing. Assistant Secretary Axelrod stressed that BIS's preference is that companies invest in front-end compliance programs and enhancements rather than just paying fines to the U.S. agencies at the end of the day. Such investments will be more effective by targeting the root cause of evasion highlighted in the U.S. agency's guidance documents. Remember, these guidance documents are relevant not only to front-end efforts, they also form the U.S. agency's views as to what circumstances might indicate an awareness of high probability of evasion or diversion or even willful conduct. It would be dangerous to assume that U.S. agencies must find a smoking gun to bring enforcement actions they do not. Both knowledge and willfulness can be proven circumstantial evidence. Tom?
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are off to our fan favorites, shout outs, and rants. We'll keep the same order, and I will bat fifth for today's episode. So, Matt Kelly, do you have a shout out and or rant for us?
I do. I have a rant, I suppose, against KPMG and its many affiliates around the world, which yet again have been tagged by regulators for employees at KPMG's affiliates cheating on internal tests and licensing exams. For anybody who says, wait, isn't this familiar? That's because it is. Because KPMG was first sanctioned by the Securities and Exchange Commission for cheating on these internal tests in 2019. And then accounting regulators sanctioned KPMG's Australia unit in 2021. And then along the way, KPMG affiliates in, let me see if I have the list right, Colombia, India, and Britain have all been sanctioned for cheating in 2022. And now, late news here, KPMG was fined by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board $25 million for cheating in its Netherlands unit. That is the largest fine that the PCAOB has ever imposed for anything at all in its 20-year history, I think. But the Netherlands affiliate, which is KPMG NV, I mean, these guys were cheating and just you couldn't believe it. They were cheating clear into 2022 when the regulators had first started slapping around the firm in 2019. So come on, by now, they had to have known that cheating on employee tests, licensing exams, CPA exams, training modules and whatnot, that's a thing. They shouldn't do it. Everybody knew that the regulators were after this, and yet the Netherlands employees were doing it anyways. My favorite was that this claimed the head of assurance for KPMG NV, who was engaged in cheating, where he had staffers sitting next to him, helping him to take the tests or to give him answers. He has been barred from public accounting as a profession forever, I believe. And then just to put a cherry on top of this, one thing that really stuck in the craw of the PCAOB enforcement people was they went to the firm, the affiliate firm in the Netherlands, and asked them, are you aware of any cheating that happened at the firm before July 2022? And the firm said, no, we are not. And that statement was first reviewed by the affiliate's management board and its supervisory board, both of which had board members who were doing cheating. during 2022 and before, and were then asked to certify it is correct that we knew of no cheating when they themselves had been cheating. And you don't even know what to say anymore. I get it that all the big four firms do this. I know they all do. PCAOB, by coincidence, they also sanctioned 2 affiliates of Deloitte. And in the past, they have sanctioned PwC for this. So I will have to check and make sure whether or not any Ernst & Young affiliates have been sanctioned yet. But I know that cheating is rampant. I get that it happens at many firms. We know that it shouldn't. But KPMG's many affiliates really take this to a whole new level. I mean, on an abstract dimension, you almost have to admire the cheating that these guys do and how utterly incomprehensible it is to me that you would think you could get away with it, because they did not. But good Lord, guys. All right, that's it. That's me off my soapbox.
Well, the bar is set very high today. Karen Woody, what do you have for us?
I'm going to keep the theme of Groundhog Day, just as Matt had, again, because just like the last time I was here, I talked about Panawatt and I talked about Caitlin Clark. So I'm back at it again, Caitlin Clark, this time as a rant, because we saw this week the difference in salaries, and we saw that the Denver Nuggets mascot is going to make, I think, 7x more than Caitlin Clark will make in her first year at the NBA. So that's a bit of a rant, and I think it's a self-evident one, but I guess on the flip side, the sort of other side of that coin is that transparency and that knowledge that now everyone has, and how egregiously different those pay scales are, given how much exposure Caitlin's brought to the game and to all of it. I hope this fixes it in some ways, but it's been, I think, an obvious rant about that salary difference between literally even the mascots and the top player in the WNBA.
Jonathan Marks, do you have a rant and or shout out for us today?
Ovo lupo commentaire. Isn't that the fox guarding the hen house, Matt? I think that's the Latin term. I don't know. I didn't go to law school, so all those things like ipse dixit and pari passu and ducis tecum, and I don't know how I learned how to say them over the years. They're probably not right, but at least I give it a try. Actually, I got a huge shout out. So, Tom, I'm going to throw out a number, and for Jay and Matt too, and Karen, I'm not excluding you from this, but it's a little, I don't know, it's a little bit more tainted here today. 2,632. Does that ring a bell?
It does not.
I'll give you a hint. He was replaced by a rookie.
Wally Pipp?
2,632.
Is it Cal Ripken?
Yes.
Okay,
Karen
yep.
Woody gets it.
I'm DC. That was our team before the Nationals. You have to know that.
632 consecutive games. Huge shout out to Cal, but that's not really my shout out. My shout out is to a young man, Kevin Ford, who worked 27 years at Burger King without missing a day of work. And when this got out, there was a social media push, and they raised $450,000 for this chap who went out and bought a house. 27 years of work at Burger King, having it your way, you rule, and never missed a day of work. So, Cal, sorry to say, but your 2,632 consecutive games sort of gets really overshadowed by this gentleman, Kevin Ford, who worked 27 years at Burger King without missing a day of work.
Well done. Jay Rosen, do you have a shout out and or rant for us?
It's a semi-rant. And last Sunday night, CBS broadcast the 100th concert in a row, or the 100th sold out by Billy Joel. And Billy Joel has passionate fans, but due to a confluence of the Masters and the show starting early, as Billy started to play his finale of Piano Man, his most loved song in the world, what did CBS do? They cut to local news. So the outcry is not the Heidi game from 1968 between the Raiders and the Jets, but, God damn it, CBS tries to do something good and they get egg on their face. So that's my lukewarm rant.
I'm going to shout out, and I'm going to shout out to Senator Robert Menendez, who just gave every divorce lawyer in America a new way to make money. How do you do that? Well, you get accused of bribery and corruption and you blame your wife. Yes, he's throwing his wife under the bus. First, he asked for a separate trial. The reason? Well, it was her. It was his wife that got the new car after she wrecked her first one. It was her wife that got all the cash that was delivered to his office. And it was his wife who got the gold bars that she kept in the safe storage room in their house. And guess what? She never told him. So, Senator Robert Menendez, I shout out to your chutzpah. I shout out to your giving divorce lawyers an entirely new way to make money. And if anybody else is charged with bribery and corruption, just throw your wife under the bus. All right, guys, 1 hour and 23 minutes. 1 hour and 23 seconds. What a great episode. I can't wait to see what we do next.
Thanks, Tom.
Thanks, Tom.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks all.
Karen Woody.